The reading today is actually from the Unitarian Universalist Association, a curriculum. It's called Against the Flow, Orthodoxy and Heresy. Author Leonard Levy, in his book Blasphemy, notes that the word heresy is not a Hebrew term. In fact, there is no equivalent for it in the pre-Christian era. Heresy, which is defined as a view not consistent with the church, depends entirely on the existence of an orthodox religion. Both orthodoxy and heresy were foreign ideas to the earliest Christians, who lived with a variety of interpretations of the Gospels and church practices, depending on the locale and the local teaching. All of that ended in the late 4th century of the Common Era, and several factors contributed to the change. In the year 313, after Constantine united the Roman Empire, Christianity became the state religion. Constantine saw a unified creed or a dogma as essential to a unified empire, and importantly, the lack of such a creed as a threat to power. The political and strategic goal dovetailed neatly with a growing crisis in Christian thought, which struggled with the need to define a new religion in such a way as to retain the unity of God without sacrificing the divinity of Christ. Early church theologians had to get the doctrine right, not only for the future of the church, but because the right path to salvation was at stake. A series of ecumenical councils starting in the year 325 at Nicaea set out to establish the consistent doctrine of the church, a creed for all. As a result, for the first time, Christians began to persecute one another for differences of opinion and faith. If one were found to hold views inconsistent with the teaching of the church or heresy, they could be charged with crimes against both the church and the state. Levy writes, imperial edicts eventually deprived all heretics and pagans of the right to worship, banned them from civil offices, exposed them to heavy fines, confiscation of property, banishment, and in certain cases, death. By the year 435, there were 66 laws against Christian heretics, plus many others against pagans. The purpose of persecution was to convert the heretics and heathen, thus establishing uniformity. Note that this uniformity was not just a matter of church, but also a matter of the state. A cohesive church served as the basis for a uniform, strong political empire. Writers on Unitarian and Universalist history have long pointed to these early heretics as our spiritual ancestors, meaning that though we hold little in common with them in terms of our theological belief, we do share a sympathetic understanding, an understanding of the right to hold a different point of view. You know, I've always thought it was interesting how Unitarian Universalists, we don't just root for the underdog, we really do root for the heretic. And we get a lot of enjoyment out of it. And it really does make a lot of sense because we are a religion built on heresy. And without our long history of heretical beliefs and heretical believers, we would not have the religion we practice today. UU minister Victoria Safford said it so well, writing, "Many UUs are accustomed to self-identity as exiles, or at least emigrants, either from some other religious tradition or from an utterly unchurched secular life. For most of us, our emigration has been voluntary. We were not excommunicated or banished from the churches and the temples of our childhood. We walked, and nothing forced us to come here. Technically, we are often more willful expatriates than persecuted exiles. But within our collective memory, the shared history of our tradition is carried the imprint of true exile. Unitarians martyred by Calvin or the Inquisition, their books forbidden, their churches destroyed, their communities demolished in Poland, in Spain, Italy, Romania. Read one way, our history is the story of gadflies and rabble-rousers, perpetual malcontents and incurable heretics, always inconveniently pushing the boundaries of convention. Read another way, and perhaps more honestly, UU history is the story of those who could not with integrity abide imposed belief or imposed religious practice. It was there they faced the most awful kind of exile, separation from their own hearts, their own consciences, their God. That's the end quote. So today I'll be telling you the stories of two heretics embraced by the Unitarian side of our tradition. The first is Arius, who lived in the 300s of the Common Era. The second is Michael Servetus. Who's heard of Michael Servetus? He's really popular among Unitarians. He's our guy. He lived in the 1500s. And yes, as the sermon title indicates, Michael Servetus was truly a hunted heretic. But we will start with Arius. And this information is based in the writings of religious educator Gail Forsyth Vale. So Arius was kind of a big deal in early Christianity. And if you've studied Christian history, he was probably in your textbook with at least several paragraphs dedicated to him. Arius was a Libyan priest who served in Alexandria, Egypt, and he was really, really popular. He was the priest rock star of his day. He wrote poetry and he sang songs and he used them in his religious teachings. He was loved by the sailors and the dock workers, of which Alexandria had plenty, and he was loved by the young people. Crowds gathered regularly to hear him preach about a Jesus whose teachings could be emulated in order to be closer to God. In the simplest of terms, practically an oversimplification of terms that will save you the kind of mind-numbing theological nuance that makes UU brains explode, I'll just say that Arius preached that Jesus began as a human being and was so holy that God adopted him as his son. You can see how that view might cause a few problems. Alexander, the main bishop of the city, was in charge of Arius, and he had a very, very different idea about Jesus. Continuing the oversimplification to avoid brain explosion, we'll just say that he said that Jesus had been one with God since the very beginning, and then when Jesus was on earth, he was God living as a person. In addition, Alexander taught that people were basically sinful and that the whole point of Jesus was that he had lived and died to save people from their sins. In a nutshell, Arius ended up getting in really big trouble with his boss. But Arius was really popular, so the Arius versus Alexander arguments began and continued in Alexandria, resulting in factions throughout the city that sometimes escalated to violence. And as it happens, religious unrest isn't good for empire. So the Emperor Constantine was determined to put a stop to it. And that's when he decided he needed a standard one-size-fits-all religion that would be was necessary to maintain order. And so he called the Council of Nicaea, about 100 bishops, in the year 325, basically to make everyone get on the same page about what this Christianity thing was about. And at this meeting, Bishop Alexander was there with his supporters, and he quickly convinced the council that Arius and his ideas were dangerous and heretical and even possibly diabolical. By the time they had finished, all but 2 of the 100 bishops there were on Alexander's side, condemning Arius. Arius, not being a bishop, he was not allowed to speak on his own behalf. The bishops recorded their newly determined orthodoxy in what is known as the Nicene Creed. Everyone was required to sign it. Arius and the 2 bishops who supported him refused. They were declared heretics, perhaps the very first official ones, and sent into exile. And there were a few more councils, more dissension, and more violence over the following years. Arius was in and out of favor during that whole period, and he never wavered in his beliefs. But in the end, what is now known as Arianism is still considered a heresy. The story of Arius leaves me with the desire to ask a lot of what-if questions. What if Arius had a nicer, more supportive boss? What if the Council of Nicaea never happened? Gosh, what if Arius had somehow won at the debate at the Council of Nicaea? What if Christianity never became the official religion of the Roman Empire and was left to its own devices to develop? What would it look like? Would it have even survived? I think it's safe to say our world would look really different now. I have no idea in what way, but it would be different if Constantine hadn't tied Christianity to his empire. So let's zoom ahead forward now to the 1500s. This is the period of the Renaissance, and the Protestant Reformation was shiny and new. This is the setting of our second heretic story, the story of Michael Servetus. And of course, he is one of Unitarianism's all-time favorite martyrs, even though he really wasn't Unitarian. Unlike Arius, you probably won't find Michael Servetus in your Christian history textbook. But yet he is said to be the most celebrated martyr of the 16th century. What a title, you know? In some ways, Servetus, he was a throwback to Arius 1,200 years earlier. He challenged both the Catholic and the Protestant churches to a pre-Nicene purity, saying it involves restoration to the original Christianity before Constantine. And he said it was not about reformation, which of course is referring to the work of Luther. And this information on Michael Servetus comes from a very, very lengthy article by Peter Hughes in the Dictionary of UU Biography. So Servetus was born in Spain in 1506, thereabouts, they're not entirely sure. And he was obviously a very, very brilliant young man because while he was still in his teens, he was sent off to France to study law. He was also fluent in a number of languages, which allowed him to read the Bible in their original formats, in Greek and Hebrew. And when he read the Bible closely, he found no reference in it to the Trinity. After his studies in France, he came back to his hometown, that was 1529, to work for a Franciscan monk. And this wasn't just any Franciscan monk. This was the monk who ended up being the chaplain to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. So Michael Servetus got to travel all around Europe with the emperor's entourage. He saw firsthand behind the scenes things about what was going on with the church and the state. He saw firsthand the riches of the church and the exaltation of the Pope and some bad behavior of priests. He became so disillusioned by what he saw that he ran off and became a Protestant. First to Basel, Switzerland, and then to Strasbourg, which was even more tolerant of the wild Protestant he had become. In 1531, at about age 26, he published the book he is best known for, which is called On the Errors of the Trinity, and he had been working on this book for about 4 years. The publication of his book was not received well even among his Protestant friends. Protestantism was brand new, and it was what you might call in the survival mode. There was great fear of being crushed by the Catholic Church. The Protestants did not want to poke the bear. They had to choose their battles. Most Protestants thought Servetus went too far in his book, believing it was both theologically and politically dangerous. The new Protestantism was not ready to mess with the Trinity. But Servetus, who had this almost crazy determination or hard-headedness, I don't know what it was, but he just would not be deterred. So in 1532, he published a follow-up to his book called Dialogues on the Trinity. And this just gave him more negative attention, and his books were confiscated, and Servetus was run out of several Protestant towns, and finally the Spanish Inquisition began to look for him. Yeah. And he kind of realized then that his death warrant had been signed, so he escaped to Paris and lived under the alias Michel de Villeneuve. And obviously a very brilliant guy. He kept busy by studying math and medicine at university. And at university, he met a young John Calvin, who was soon run out of Paris himself for his Protestantism. So in France, Servetus worked as an editor, he became a geography expert and lecturer, and then he went back and finished his studies in medicine. He was a literal Renaissance man, and he's actually known as a pioneering physician too. He was the first European to publish a description of the blood's circulation through the lungs, what we call pulmonary respiration. And because he was kind of a magnet for drama, under his alias, he actually had another run-in with the Inquisition for practicing astrology along with medicine. Fortunately, he was acquitted, and then he left Paris to practice medicine in Lyon, where he also picked up his theological writing. At this time, he also initiated, in 1546, a secret correspondence with his old acquaintance, John Calvin. By this time, Calvin, we're talking close to 14 years later, had moved up in the world, having become pastor and chief reformer of Geneva, and the most prestigious figure in the reform movement. Servetus thought, hey, this is my Protestant buddy. We're going to have this great dialogue about Protestant theology. So he started a correspondence with Calvin, and the correspondence continued for a while. They tossed back and forth their ideas. And then Servetus went so far as to send an advance copy of his new book to Calvin, which included the text of all of Servetus's letters to Calvin. And he also sent Calvin a fully critiqued, marked up version of Calvin's latest publication. So earlier in his career, John Calvin had been accused of being an Arian, an anti-Trinitarian, and he paid the price with some years in exile. So he wasn't going to risk all that he gained for the theology that Michael Servetus so much loved. Calvin could not afford to be associated with Servetus's dangerous ideas, and so he cut off his contact with Michael Servetus. And he even wrote to another friend that if Servetus ever had the mind to come to Geneva, he would not get out alive. So soon, John Calvin blew Michael Servetus's cover, and he was arrested by the Inquisition in France. After the arrest and interrogation, Servetus managed to escape from prison and cross the border into Geneva, of all places, perhaps to try and meet with his frenemy, John Calvin. So this is where I really don't understand his thinking. Servetus, he's in Geneva, he goes to church, and he's recognized, and he's arrested and tried for heresy by Protestant authorities. The Council of Geneva convicted Servetus of anti-Trinitarianism and opposition to child baptism, and he was burned at the stake October 27th, 1553, allegedly with at least one of his books strapped to his leg. So the death of Michael Servetus unleashed a heated debate within Protestantism about what they should do about heretics. John Calvin defended the council's decision because to spare Servetus would have been to endanger the souls of many. A person more favorable to Servetus said, "To kill a man is not to protect a doctrine, it is but to kill a man. When Servetus fought with reasons and writings, he should have been repulsed by reasons and writings." So this is a little summary of Michael Servetus' beliefs and some evidence as to why Calvin was forced to break up with him, I suppose. Servetus said the Trinity is not spelled out in the Bible. He did not believe in original sin. He believed that Jesus had one nature, fully human and fully divine. He was God come to earth. He believed that all people, regardless of religion, are able to improve, and that grace is available to all. He was not a fan of predestination. And he believed that all things are part of God. So this is a sum up on Michael Servetus from Peter Hughes. He says, sharply critical though he was of the orthodox formulation of the Trinity, Servetus is better described as a highly unorthodox Trinitarian rather than a Unitarian. Still, aspects of his thinking His critique of existing Trinitarian theology, his devaluation of the doctrine of original sin, and his fresh examination of biblical proof text did influence those who later inspired or founded Unitarian churches in Poland and Transylvania. Public criticism of those responsible for his execution, the Reformed Protestants in Geneva and their pastor John Calvin, stirred proto-Unitarians and other groups on the radical left wing of the Reformation to develop and later institutionalize their own heretical views. Widespread aversion to Servetus' death has been taken as signaling the birth in Europe of the idea of religious tolerance, a principle now more important to modern UUs than anti-Trinitarianism. Right, so that's the end of that quote. So yeah, I think it's interesting that it all kind of comes back to religious tolerance. If there's an antidote to the orthodoxy versus heresy debate, it would be tolerance, wouldn't it? As UUs, we study the heretics of centuries past, and we see something of ourselves in them. They were people who thought things through themselves. They were people who followed their conscience, even if it didn't agree with the book or with what others believed. Our religious traditions, both the Unitarian and Universalists, have generally shunned orthodoxy, which has allowed Unitarian Universalism to develop into the theologically open and diverse religion we have today. But have you ever noticed that heretical or revolutionary ideas, once they become mainstream, can easily become orthodoxy? I mean, take John Calvin. He was a reformer, but from his reforms, a new orthodoxy was born, generating a new set of heretics. So the trip from radical to reactionary can often be a very short one. And before we are too taken with our heretical history, we still must honor the tension between orthodoxy and heresy in our church and in our lives. Too much heresy leads us to focus on our differences and not our commonalities. And we become, that proverbial herd of cats. Yet too much orthodoxy stifles the individual spirit. So it is a fine balance. That's why as UUs, we value our individuality and our freedom, but we must also hold up the things we have in common, our values, our covenants, our interdependence, which is the glue that holds this merry band of heretics together. May it be so.